Freeman Delusion, the organised pseudo-legal commercial argument in Australia.
So with pseudo-law, like the term people probably are more familiar with is sovereign citizen. I mean, I think it really, I think people's eyes sort of blur when you start trying to actually explain it because it's so bizarre in some, obviously.
So the language of sovereign citizen came from the United States. There's no clear number about the people who say whether they're a sovereign citizen or not. The language of sovereign citizen is disputed by many of these people because they say that it's a pejorative term and they don't want to be associated with it. And so I guess pseudo-law is a broader term for sovereign citizens. They're one subset within that larger group.
There are websites around that sort of explain that this stuff is made up and it doesn't work. One that I think is really valuable is Rob Sudi's Freeman Delusion website.
Yes.
That is just the most comprehensive archive of this sort of stuff that I've ever seen across anywhere in the world.
Yes.
And that's incredibly valuable. So I'd encourage people to look at that and share that with people who've sort of fallen down with this.
A sovereign citizen is a particular type of a pseudo-law movement. So pseudo-law is the umbrella term that captures all of these various other types of movement. Sovereign citizen is probably the most famous and the one that most people are familiar with, but there's a whole bunch of other groups. And we get a huge spectrum of different people that are A, using pseudo-law, B, maybe describing themselves as sovereign citizens, and then C, member of what might be conceived of as the sovereign citizen movement. Each one of them are a little bit different, and we cover a broad political spectrum from left to right, with some of them quite innocent and naive in their use, to others being quite radicalised.
And with Freeman Delusion, the organised pseudo-legal commercial argument in Australia.
So I think a lot of people think it's just an American concept imported here. That concept of a sovereign citizen, that's definitely a pretty American term referring to a kind of anti-tax movement that was occurring in the United States in the 70s and 80s. But here we have a long history of pseudo-law as well. Sovereign citizen is quite a specific sort of American genre of this, but pseudo-law sort of encapsulates the whole. Broadly, we use the term pseudo-law in our book just to capture the whole range of ideas that kind of fall under this bucket in Australia, because we have a long history of it here that predates even some of those American sovereign citizen concepts. So we have people going all the way to the High Court in the 80s and 90s arguing that Australian currency is not legal tender. That guy was eventually declared a vexatious litigant, actually. So we have our own history here. But I guess to put some, define it a little, I would say that pseudo-law encompasses a range of beliefs that essentially argue that certain laws are illegitimate or that the government has no authority. So talking to people that have tracked these ideas through the courts, they pointed to all these different key moments as the Australian legal system shifted in some way or some sort of pivotal moment in our political history. So the Australia Act, Australia began to kind of divorce its legal system from the UK, so you could no longer appeal to the Privy Council back in the United Kingdom. The High Court here became the highest authority. Key documents weren't executed in the right way, and that sort of severed the legality of laws that followed. It often ties to these key moments because I think pseudo-law really does reflect in many ways sort of, I guess, Australia's relationship with its political and legal history. And these moments, these pivotal moments are where these ideas kind of catch on and grow around.
So a lot of people point to America and say, these are ideas being imported into Australia from the US, like on social media. But in fact, there's a long history here. But we've also had a long history here that's entirely our own around micronations, where people choose a plot of land and just suddenly declare the federal government no longer has any control over that land. They own it. They have complete control. So there's like a really strong history here, which I think intertwines with many of the questions that perennially come up about Australia. What's the effect of colonialisation? What is ownership of the land? What does the law mean to us here? Because we have this strange relationship with the UK. We still have our head of state over there, which just reflects, I think, our complex relationship with law and power.
And at its heart, pseudo-law is about a time when the law was supposedly good, right, and just, and it's now become corrupted because sort of evil outside forces overtaken the country. But Australia's kind of founded on this idea that a foreign nation can come and take over a country. That's how we were founded at the moment of colonialisation. So it has that kind of broad historical resonance too, like outside bodies coming in and taking over.
Yeah, could you tell us about that website and its founder?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our exploration of pseudo-law in Australia, we came across a gentleman called Robert Sudi, who he runs a website called the Freeman Delusion, which is a really thorough and useful kind of record of all the pseudolaw arguments that have been made in Australia. So he's collecting all the case law and all the writing about these topics. And he himself is a former practitioner of pseudolaw. So he gave me the story. So back in the 2000s, he had some driving charges and he went, he wanted to fight them. He didn't think they were just. So he went online and came across some of these pseudolaw concepts. And when he tried to apply them in court, obviously they didn't work. But the magistrate who was on that day, David Halpern, he had some other cases that had fallen over. So he had some time to engage with Sudi and sort of give him a hearing and also push back. And Sudi went from there to do his own research, as the quote goes again, and sort of realised the error of the thought process that had led him to use those pseudolaw arguments in court. But it was interesting, like he gave some really good insights, I think, into why these ideas appeal to people. People, as I was saying, do turn to them in a moment of crisis. And when you do look at things like our legal system, our banking system, even our healthcare system, these are really like complex entities with their own language. Like if you're not a lawyer, the law can be pretty impenetrable and can start to look like a conspiracy arrayed against the individual. Like I don't think that's too hard to understand. So you can sort of see why people might react in such an extreme way. And he sort of pointed to things like the concept of apophenia. So it's the tendency to see meaningful connections and patterns between unrelated things. So once you sort of starting to go down this rabbit hole, you can start to sort of piece together the history of Australia, our legal system, all the sort of Baroque language of law and put it together. But instead of, coming to the way that most of us agree law operates, you might come to a completely different conclusion.
So I spoke to a man called Robert Sudi who in around 2012 had some driving offences and went online to kind of figure out a way to deal with them. He didn't think they were fair, right? And he stumbled into some of these pseudo-law ideas. When he took them to the court in front of Magistrate Halpern, he tried to use them. And David Halpern told me that day, I guess he'd had some other cases fall over, so he had time to kind of engage. And Robert was receptive to that and went away and did more research essentially and came to the conclusion that the ideas he'd tried to use weren't correct. And now he runs a website called the Freeman Delusion, which is a really valuable record of pseudo-law arguments in Australia, court records and others. So it was interesting, when somebody has the time to meaningfully engage with somebody, it can help. But of course, our courts don't really, that's very, very rare. And
Robert Sudi is a man who lives up in Northern Rivers, and he maintains this website now called the Freeman Delusion, which is probably the best record in Australia of pseudo-law belief. So he gathers all the case law and dissects all the ideas that people try in courts. But this project is the result of him actually having dabbled in this himself. So many decades ago, now he had some traffic infringement issues, some fines and things. Went to the magistrate's court to fight them using pseudo-law ideas that he'd found on the internet. But the magistrate of the day who was on deck, David Halpern, he just had some time. Some other cases had been cancelled, so he had a bit more time to talk to Robert and sort of talk him through why his ideas weren't going to fly, point him in some good directions. And it basically just sort of raised a question, I guess, in Robert's mind. In his telling, he told me he sort of went home, started doing his own research, and he actually came across a really interesting case in Canada called Meads versus Meads. It's a family law case, and basically it's one of the most complete dissections of pseudo-law beliefs. The judge in that case went through each element of the defendant, the husband's claims and all his different, red thumbprint on the documents and all that jazz. And Robert Sudi here in Australia found that a really compelling document and a really interesting dissection. It did start to change his mind, and it was a journey. But now he maintains this website. It's probably the best, most complete record of pseudo-law thought in Australia. So people can, but they it's that combination of a generous ear and your own journey, an intellectual humility, like Patton said, the willingness to concede you're wrong. And I think we can all probably learn something from Robert, because there's all beliefs that we probably should have challenged, not just conspiratorial ones.
Freeman Delusion, the organised pseudo-legal commercial argument in Australia.
And former magistrate David Halpern joins us now.
Especially since I've left the bench, we've become friends. A fellow called Robert Sudi, who runs a website called the Freeman Delusion, which devotes itself to debunking sovereign citizen pseudo-law issues. When I was sitting in Grafton Court, I had a fellow come before me who started arguing about a traffic matter on some common law principles, Magna Carta, sovereign citizenship type arguments. He's at that good end of the spectrum where people were challenging the law with some unique arguments, but they were misguided, and I fortunately had just been preparing an education paper on it for other magistrates, and so I gave him all this material saying basically what he was spouting was wrong and here's why. And he asked for an adjournment, took it off and read the stuff and came back a week later saying, "You're right, I can't drive without my rego and I'm going to pay it, and sorry for wasting your time, let's get on with our lives." But he then went and formed something which is called the Freeman Delusion website, which is the leading Australian and probably worldwide website on the Freeman Delusion. In other words, challenging sovereign citizenship. And it's a collection of articles and his own writings, but also expert reports and references to court cases around the world showing that these arguments are wrong. And he started researching it and writing this website, which anyone can access and have a look online, where he painstakingly, case by case, demolishes the arguments of the pseudo-law sovereign citizen movement. And he does so with great reference to law, to research, to academic publications. And this is somebody who, I don't actually know what his educational level is, but he's certainly not a lawyer, and I don't think he went to uni. Now, the reason I tell that story is because people are capable of change, and people who are spouting this material are neither necessarily right-wing, necessarily ill-educated, or necessarily misguided in the sense that they're deliberately taking on stuff that they know is wrong. And by entering into honest conversations with them, I think you can change minds. So my best advice to people who are delving into this stuff is to treat them with respect and accepting that people can change and get out of the rabbit hole that they're climbing down. Some people are just too far gone, but generally speaking, I think calm and sensible conversation can do an enormous amount.
Freeman Delusion, the organised pseudo-legal commercial argument in Australia.